April 1943. The dawn crept over the English countryside like a ghost reluctant to rise. Frost clung to the runways of the airfield, each blade of grass sparkling under the pale light. The silence was fragile, the kind that exists only between the echoes of war. Then came the sound. The distant rumble of returning bombers. One by one, they emerged through the mist, wings torn, engines coughing, fuselages riddled with holes. The ground crews ran to meet them, boots crunching on gravel slick with oil. The smell of burned fuel and scorched metal mixed with the damp morning air. Men shouted over the whine of failing hydraulics. One bomber limped in on a single engine, its nose dipped like a wounded bird. Another skidded across the tarmac, sparks trailing beneath its ruined undercarriage. Among the chaos stood Harold Finch, a man whose world was built of bolts, smoke, and silence. His face, streaked with grease, carried no expression. He simply watched. Each damaged machine that landed was another life barely saved, another tomorrow that depended on his hands. Finch had been a mechanic since before the war. He had grown up in a clockmaker's shop in Manchester, where time itself was a thing you could touch. Gears, springs, balance wheels ticking in rhythm. Now, on this field of noise and death, he still listened for that rhythm. But here, time wasn't measured by seconds. It was measured by sorties, by survival. That morning, the briefing room buzzed with voices thick with fatigue. The commander's voice cut through. 23 bombers down for repairs. None can be spared. We need them airborne by dawn tomorrow. A pause followed. The words hung in the cold air like a verdict. Finch looked at the schematic pinned to the wall, rows of machines broken beyond recognition. Engines that had been pushed past reason. Propellers bent, pistons shattered, oil lines snapped clean through. To fix them all in 24 hours was madness, yet the order stood. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the low hum of distant artillery from across the channel. Finch stepped out into the grey light, his breath visible in the cold. Around him, mechanics scrambled with wrenches and welding torches, shouting for parts that didn't exist. The supply trucks were delayed, another convoy lost to the sea. He crouched beside a bomber with its cowling peeled open, exposing the broken heart within. The Merlin engine, once a thing of grace and power, now lay silent, cracked turbine blades glinting like broken glass. Finch ran his thumb over the fracture, feeling the story written in its edges. Heat, pressure, fatigue. He knew the language of failure better than any man. Can it fly again? Someone asked behind him. Finch didn't look up. It has to. As the hours crawled forward, the hangar became a world of smoke and echo. Sparks danced from welding torches, lighting faces hollowed by exhaustion. The sound of hammers striking metal became the heartbeat of the place. Each clang was a promise against the impossible. But promises don't make parts. By noon, the truth was sinking in. The spare engines were gone. Bearings, pistons, even basic fittings, all used up or damaged. Finch's team worked in silence, improvising where they could, salvaging from wrecks that would never fly again. The younger mechanics looked to him for direction, for a miracle. "Sir," one said quietly, "what if we can't do it?" Finch didn't answer right away. He tightened a bolt that didn't fit, wiped his hands on a rag black with grease, and finally said, "Then we make it fit." Outside, the clouds gathered heavy, sullen. Rain began to fall, tapping against the tin roof like the ticking of some unseen clock counting down the hours left. By evening, the hangar floor was littered with broken parts and broken hopes. The bombers stood like silent giants waiting to be reborn. Finch sat alone beside one of them, his eyes fixed on a turbine blade split clean through its center. He had seen men die with less damage. His commanding officer approached, boots echoing against the concrete. "Finch, command wants a progress report." Finch didn't look up. "Tell them we're out of time, out of parts, and running on fumes." The officer sighed. "Then start praying." When the man left, Finch leaned back against the cold metal of the bomber's fuselage. Outside, the rain turned to sleet. Every drop against the roof sounded like the second hand of a clock, relentless, unforgiving. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought of the sky, the endless grey expanse where these machines were meant to live. Somewhere up there, the pilots waited, boys, most of them. barely 20. Their lives hung on the sound of engines that no longer existed. He opened his eyes again. The hangar light flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the scattered tools. Finch picked up the fractured turbine blade once more, running his hand along the crack as if it could speak. Metal, he thought, had its limits. But maybe imagination did not. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 60:10 p.m. 12 hours left. Around him, the other mechanics had gone quiet. The only sound was the slow drip of rainwater finding its way through the roof. Finch felt the weight of the war pressing down, not from the sky, but from the silence of men who had run out of ideas. He looked again at the engines, at the wreckage, at the futility of it all, and then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. Not with joy, but with defiance. Because somewhere in the chaos there was still a puzzle to solve. As night fell, the air grew colder. Lamps flickered to life, throwing halos of gold onto the slick floor. The sound of thunder rolled in from the distance. Finch stayed where he was, staring at the blade in his hands. Every instinct told him it was impossible. But impossibility, he knew, was only the name given to something not yet understood. He placed the blade gently on the workbench and began to strip the engine down piece by piece. Not to fix it, not yet, but to understand it. Every bolt, every fracture, every burn mark told a story of strain and resilience. The war had turned machines into soldiers, and soldiers into machines. The hours slipped by unnoticed. Outside, the world dissolved into rain and wind. Inside, Finch worked in silence, his thoughts like the ticking of the clocks from his childhood. He remembered his father's voice, calm and patient. When something breaks, Harold, it's not the end. It's just the beginning of knowing how it worked. He had never forgotten that. Now, as he sat surrounded by fragments of steel and hope, he felt that same lesson stirring again. The engines could be rebuilt. The question was how, and with what. His fingers traced the jagged edge of the turbine once more. If only he had the materials. If only he had time. The sound of the storm deepened outside. A flash of lightning illuminated the hangar, throwing his shadow across the wall, a lone man against a sea of machines. For a brief moment, everything seemed still. Then the generator coughed and died, plunging the room into darkness. The rain filled the silence like static. Finch reached for his lantern, lit it, and watched the flame tremble in the draught. Its glow spilled across the workbench, catching on the curve of the cracked blade. He exhaled slowly. The flame reflected in the metal looked almost alive. Tomorrow, the bombers had to fly. Tomorrow, men's lives would depend on him. He pressed a hand against the cold engine casing, feeling the heartbeat that wasn't there yet. "Come on, old girl," he whispered. "We've got one more fight in us." The wind howled outside as if answering back. Finch leaned over the bench, his eyes narrowing. The clock above him ticked once, loud and lonely. He didn't look up. The night was long, and the impossible had only just begun. Night folded over the airfield like a heavy coat, damp at the edges and smelling of rain. By 8:15 p.m., the storm had settled into a steady hiss, water threading off the hangar roof and pooling beneath the wings. The lantern Finch lit burned with a meek flame, throwing a warm oval onto his workbench and leaving the rest of the cavernous space in a slow, breathing dark. He stood with sleeves rolled past his elbows, hands already nicked and blackened, the sting of solvent in the cuts like salt. The Merlin engine before him lay opened wide, a cathedral of steel and stress. He traced the route oil should have taken, the path heat should have bled away, the line where vibration had turned to fracture. Every edge caught the light and answered him in a different tone. Outside, a lorry clattered across the tarmac and stopped short. Men shouted for crates that never arrived. The convoy from the coast had not come. Rumor said U-boats had taken 2 ships in the night. Finch listened without turning. The war had a way of speaking in half-truths and full consequences. At 80:37, a young mechanic named Will brought him a crate marked with a faded stencil. "Last of the bearings," Will said, voice thin from cold. "Wrong size for this engine." Finch nodded. "Hand me the micrometer." They measured the bearing shoulders in silence. The difference was small, but in planes small differences turned into funerals. Finch weighed the metal in his palm, feeling its temperature and texture, listening to its honesty. He set it down without a word and reached for a rag. "Sir, we'll begin. The lads they're asking if we'll make it." Finch looked up, lantern light cutting a narrow path across his face. "We will work until there is nothing left to try. That is how we'll make it." Will nodded, swallowed, and vanished into the dim, as if the dark had closed a door. By 90:10, Finch had the impeller housing stripped and propped on wooden blocks. The turbine blade sat on the bench like a wounded bone. He rotated it in the light, seeing not just the crack, but the story of how the crack had learned to be a crack. Born from imbalance, fed by heat, widened by hours spent pushing through cloud and flak. His thumb drifted along the arc and stopped at a hairline he'd missed before. There was a second failure hidden like a whispered doubt. He rubbed the spot slowly until the doubt came into view. There it was. And there was no replacement. The hangar clock clacked to 90:30. Somewhere a kettle hissed and went quiet, forgotten. The lantern flame wavered with a draft that smelled of burnt casings and wet rope. Finch closed his eyes for a beat and saw the room from above, islands of light floating in a sea of black, each island a small war of its own. Men moved between them like pilgrims. The sound of a distant generator hiccoughed and caught again. The commanding officer returned. His boots announced him before his voice did. "Finch, headquarters radioed. The morning op is critical. Weather might open a window. We launch or we lose people we can't afford to lose." Finch kept his eyes on the blade. "We don't have the parts. Then make the parts." "That isn't how metal works," Finch said softly. The officer's breath fogged in the cold. "No one's asking you for miracles. Just victory." He left the words behind and walked away, as though they were orders that would carry themselves. Finch exhaled slowly through his nose and reached for chalk. On the bench's scarred surface, he sketched the turbine's profile, a clean curve rendered in smudged white. He drew the stress patterns as he imagined them. Cross, hatching where the heat would pool, marking the edges where grain would drift wrong. The drawing looked like a moon half remembered from a boyhood window. When the lantern guttered, he trimmed the wick and fed it. The flame steadied, and the tiny room he had made for himself returned bench, blade, chalk, the faithful shape of a spanner, the sulk of a vise. The storm leaned harder against the roof, a gust rattled a panel loose, and the hangar moaned like an old ship. By 10:05, the junior team had disassembled 3 engines for salvage. They laid their trophies near Finch bolts, with threads barely worth saving. A length of fuel line with a kink that had cost someone altitude, a bearing cage warped out of true. Finch sorted them the way a surgeon might sort organs from donors whose names he would never know. He kept his hands gentle. The dead deserved respect, even when they were machines. Will came back, trembling through his jacket. "If we had a mill," he said, "we could reshape the shoulders, if we had alloy, if we had time." Finch repeated, as if rolling a coin along his knuckles. He nodded at a line of cowlings propped in the shadows. "Search those. The older ones, the pre-war rebuilds. Sometimes they hide surprises." Will jogged off. Finch listened to his footsteps fade, then to the hiss of the rain, then to the silence that followed both. He pinched the bridge of his nose until a white flare went off behind his eyes. Sleep pried at him from the edges. He gripped the bench until the sensation passed. At 140, he found a crate of small tools mislabeled as rations. He opened it and breathed in the dry smell of wood shavings and cold iron. Files fine-toothed and eager. Calipers that remembered accuracy. A tapping set missing the one size he needed most. He smiled anyway. A toolbox was a promise. He clamped the cracked turbine blade in the vise and worked a file along the fracture's lip. Not to fix it, not yet, but to understand its voice. The rasping scratched at the quiet, a steady, patient sound. He could feel the blade's resistance in his shoulders. The way it pushed back not just against the file, but against the simple idea of newness. This blade did not want to be reborn. It wanted to be honored and retired. War had opinions about both. By 11:15 the hangar doors banged open and a gust sprayed rain across the floor. 2 pilots stepped in, eyes red-rimmed, uniforms dark with wet. One of them saw Finch and stopped, as if recognizing the man who guarded the bridge between survival and a fall from the sky. "Sir," the pilot said. He was young enough that his voice still carried an echo of schoolyards. "They say our birds might fly by morning. Is that true?" Finch's answer took a moment to arrive. "I'm going to make sure what goes up," he said, "deserves to." The pilot glanced at the engine entrails, at the broken shapes and the patient files. He nodded once. "We'll be ready." He held Finch's gaze a moment longer, as if trying to memorize the face of the man to whom he was lending his life. Then he left, boots squeaking, the storm swallowing him whole again. Midnight came with a hard knock of the clock and a soft ache in Finch's spine. He stretched until something clicked back into place. He ate half a biscuit he couldn't taste and washed it down with tea that had lost the idea of heat. When the lantern's fuel dipped, he poured the last from a dented can and watched the wick gather it like a root. He sketched again, this time the engines breathe air in, air out, like something alive. He drew the curve a blade should hold if it wished to cup the wind without tearing it, if it wished to steer the invisible with respect. In chalk, it made sense. In steel, it needed to exist, and there lay the cruelty. He set the chalk down and pressed both hands flat on the bench, as if seeking a pulse. The wood answered with the slow thrum of rain. At 1:23 a.m., Will returned with a small Triumph war impeller from a scrapped trainer, its metal a different alloy. Its profile all wrong, but its soul intact. Finch lifted it as one might lift a relic. It was too small and too simple, a toy compared to what he needed. But it taught him something anyway. That curves remembered the men who made them, that hands left behind ideas, even when the machines moved on. He placed the trainer's blade beside the broken Merlin blade. The difference between them was a language only his fingers spoke. He closed his eyes and let touch translate. The way one edge loved the air, and the other resented it. The way one would sing at a certain speed, and the other would hiss. He had a student's patience with the lesson. The officer did not come back. No one brought news that could be used. The night grew heavier and more honest. At 1:05 a.m., the generator faltered again. And somewhere a man cursed God in a whisper. Finch turned from the bench and walked the length of the hangar, past giants that needed him. He placed a hand on each fuselage as he passed, as if giving a quiet benediction. Metals held the day's cold differently, aluminum thin and eager, steel slow and stubborn. He read those temperatures like a book. He stopped before a bomber whose skin carried a mural of small repairs, rivet beads like raindrops, patches smoothed to nearly nothing. He recognized his own weld among them, a curve he never would have made that way again. He smiled, war taught fast. When he returned to the bench, he took the cracked blade in both hands and studied its root. The failure there told him a different story, not just heat, not just stress, but installation under pressure after a long day and a longer night. Human fatigue had guided the wrench. Someone had done their best, and their best had been a fraction shy of true. The engine had forgiven it until it hadn't. He set the blade down and emptied his lungs. Forgiveness ran out everywhere, it seemed. At 1:37 a.m. rain became sleet. The tap of ice changed the hangar's music. Will dozed in a chair, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. Hands still dirty on his lap. Finch draped a canvas over him and returned to the engine. The lantern burned steady, hugging his small world with its tired light. He tried a bearing fit that he knew would not hold. He measured a shim, shaved, measured again, shaved again, coaxing the margin until it was as thin as an unspoken truth. When he slid the piece into place, it sat like a reluctant guest at a crowded table. He would not trust it. He removed it and set it aside. The war would not be fed with almosts. By 10 a.m., he found a length of tubing that could be rebent if the bend could be held. He heated it with a torch until it blushed and softened, smelled the sweet, faint note that metal gives when it is ready to forget. He coaxed the curve back, an inch at a time. Breath held, steady patience his only strength. The tube trembled like a living thing that wanted to return to pain. He let it, then asked again, and it relented. When he cooled it, he listened for the small sound of surrender, the sound that meant it would behave, because it had been given time to remember. A gust shoved at the door. The lantern flame bowed and lifted. Finch's shadow lurched across the wall and settled again. He glanced at the clock, 2:31. 14 hours gone since the first bomber limped home. 9 and some left until dawn. He checked the list he'd scribbled on a scrap of paper: bearings, impeller, fuel line, ignition harness lifting under vibration. Each item drew a small map in his head, each map leading to a dead end he refused to accept. He revised the sequence of repairs not by logic but by feel, the way a pianist might reorder a recital to suit the piano he didn't choose. When the sleet softened to rain again, he could hear the low roll of thunder far off. The storm had a long body, they were somewhere near its ribs. He took another pass with the file over the blade's crack, feathering an edge that would never be right no matter how gently he touched it. He stopped and let the quiet come back, a companion he trusted more than words. At 30:05 a.m., the pilots returned. Not to ask for news this time, to help where help was clumsy but honest. They carried cloths and held lights and fetched tools with the reverence of men touching a sacred object. One of them told a story about a dog back home who could smell rain before the clouds had decided to give it. Another spoke of fields he hadn't walked since 19. Their voices thinned the dark, and Finch allowed them to stand near, because their presence set his jaw. The engine could hear them too. He tightened a housing with their hands beneath the light, and stopped before the last quarter turn. He had learned over years that machines remembered the mood of the man who tightened them. He breathed twice, smoothed the thought, and finished the turn. When he stepped back, the engine looked less like a corpse and more like a patient at rest. The pilots left as quietly as they had come. One of them touched Finch's shoulder, a small blessing that said nothing and everything. By 30:40 am, the hangar smelled of damp canvas and warmed oil. The lantern wick had burned low. Its light sat near the table, unwilling to wander. Finch sharpened a pencil with a knife and returned to the chalk sketch. He added a note in the margin: "Balance is mercy." He did not know why he wrote it that way. It felt true in a place deeper than proof. He thought of his father's small shop, the talc dry air, the bright ringing of a tiny hammer on a tiny pin, the way a clock surrendered its anger when coaxed into exactness. The memory brought a warmth the lantern could not. He let it sit beside him like a friend. At 40:05 a.m., a messenger ran in with a sheaf of paper. Weather report: the window would be narrow, the wind unkind. Dispatch said, "Repair what you can, and what you cannot, pretend you can and pray." Finch folded the paper once, then twice, and set it beneath the lantern. Prayer was a thing he left to men who could afford it. He took the cracked blade into his hands again. The weight of it told him the truth he already knew. No file would heal it, no shim would teach it to forget. He considered doubling the route with a sleeve, rebalancing the assembly by taking a hair from each neighboring blade. Dangerous. Possible. Dangerous in a way that had a shape, which made it dangerous in a way that could be respected. He marked 3 points with a black dot. Will stirred beneath the canvas and then slept again. At 4:37 a.m., Finch heated a thin rod until it glowed and let it fade, testing its willingness to be straight. He would not weld tonight, not that, but he let his hands remember the angles anyway. He cleaned the blade until its surfaces were honest. Under grime and soot, it showed him a color that meant fatigue had lived here long. He rubbed his thumb across it, and the thumb came away grey, as if touching an old photograph. The rain eased to a whisper. The air thinned, as if the storm were running out of words. Finch drank the last of the tea. It had learned nothing from the kettle. It was still cold. He assembled the engine to the point where the missing could no longer be hidden. He left it there, a body with a heartbeat not yet invited. He wrote down what he would try. He wrote down what he would not. The list of nots was longer, it made him feel honest. The clock touched 5:10 a.m. Dawn would climb the far hedgerow in 30 minutes, maybe less. He could feel the sky preparing to be light, the way a room feels a door about to open. He cleaned the bench with slow, deliberate strokes, because order was the one luxury he could afford. He laid the cracked blade in the center and set the chalk above it. He placed beside it the small trainer blade, a memory of a simpler conversation between metal and air. He folded his hands without meaning to, and let the silence expand around him until it became a kind of courage. Footsteps approached, soft, respectful. The commanding officer stopped at the edge of the lantern's reach. No orders now, only a man dressed in the duty of other men's lives. "How many will fly?" he asked, voice low enough to leave room for truth. Finch did not turn from the bench. "As many as can be trusted." "Is that number greater than 0? "It will be," Finch said. "But I cannot promise which ones will deserve the sky." The officer nodded in the dark, a shadow agreeing with a shadow. "Dawn briefing in 20, he said. "They will want to hear a kind voice." Finch picked up the blade. It sat in his palm like a burden that had learned his hand. He looked into the fracture until it felt like a horizon. The officer's footsteps thinned and disappeared. Finch was alone with the metal and the morning. At 50:22 a.m. The lantern light flickered, fought, and held. The air sifted colder now that the storm had done its work. Somewhere a lark tried a note and gave up. The world paused on an inhale. He laid the blade flat and traced the curve of its edge one last time. He listened for the thing he sometimes heard when his fingers knew more than his mind, a small permission, a door not yet seen. It did not come. What came instead was the stubborn, simple truth. He would have to do what men feared more than failure. He would have to try something that did not exist yet. He let that truth sit with him, not as bravado but as an austerity, a rationed faith. The chalk rolled to a stop. He folded the canvas off Will's shoulders. Woke him with a touch. "Bring everyone," he said. Will brief at the engine. Quiet voices. Clear heads. They gathered as the grey of morning unfastened itself from the night. Finch spoke plainly, dividing labour like bread. No speeches. No comfort. Only the exactness of work. When the others dispersed, he remained, the cracked blade in his hand. The lantern making a small sun on the bench. He imagined the rotor spinning alive, imagined the engine warming into the sound that made the ground forget it had ever been heavy. He tried to place that sound in the space where the blade was broken and found only silence. The clock ticked again, loud enough to be mistaken for its own animal. 5:40 a.m. The hangar smelled of oil and frost, a clean cold that reminded him the world still had mornings, no matter how the night had argued otherwise. Finch lifted the blade to eye level and held it there until his arm trembled. The line of the fracture gleamed like a thin river running through a map of a country he did not choose to walk. He lowered it slowly and let it lie on the bench. He pressed both palms to the wood and bowed his head. Not in prayer, in inventory. Somewhere in the long corridors of his memory. The small clock shop opened its door and let out the tick of a thing well made. He listened. He waited. He let the waiting be a kind of work. The first thread of daylight slipped under the hangar door and drew a pale line across the floor, a blade of its own. Finch watched it touch the base of the engine stand and climb, sure and thin. The engine's shadow made room for it. He reached for the chalk and wrote 3 words at the edge of the bench, where only he would see them when he needed them most. Find the curve. Then he set the chalk aside, took the blade again, and stared into the impossible until it stared back. The hour moved, the hangar breathed. The day arrived without fanfare, and the problem remained. Lucid and whole, an iron question demanding an answer he did not yet have. He stood alone with the question, the clock ticking in small, indifferent truths, and the broken turbine in his hands, an unsolved shape waiting for a mind to meet it before the sun burned the frost from the runway. The next day began not with sunlight, but with a faint glow seeping through low clouds the color of cold iron. The airfield sat in a wet hush, puddles reflecting the broken silhouettes of bombers waiting for life. The storm had passed, but it had left everything heavy, the soil, the air, even the men. Harold Finch hadn't slept. He'd sat through the grey hours sketching, calculating, trying to make sense of the unfixable. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. But when the hangar doors opened and the crew stepped in, he was already on his feet, wiping his hands on a rag as though motion alone could keep the fatigue away. The engines loomed in front of them like wounded beasts. Oil dripped from open coals. Every surface smelled of effort, fuel, sweat, and defeat. The young mechanic stared at Finch, waiting for him to speak. He didn't waste words. Check every intake and manifold. Strip what you can salvage. Nothing goes unused. They obeyed, scattering into the grey light. The sound of tools striking metal replaced the morning quiet, hollow, rhythmic, determined. Finch turned to his bench. The cracked turbine blade lay where he'd left it, beside the chalk outline that had become his only compass. He picked it up again, weighing it as if time might have changed its nature. It hadn't. The metal was still broken, still mocking the limits of his craft. By mid-morning, the commander's voice cut through the hangar like a whip. "Where are we on readiness?" Finch answered without looking up. 3 engines partial, 2 beyond repair. "We'll need parts that don't exist." The officer's tone turned hard. "Then invent them. Headquarters expects air cover by tonight." He walked away before Finch could respond. Orders had no patience for truth. Outside, a fresh wave of planes rolled in, not from mission, but from chaos. One had clipped a tree landing in fog. Another came in on fumes, belly scraping the runway. The ground crews ran toward them, their boots throwing mud across the tarmac. Finch stepped out into the cold. He could feel the pressure tightening around him, invisible, unrelenting. Men's lives waited on his hands. But the materials of salvation were scattered across a war that never paused to catch its breath. He leaned into the wind, squinting toward the line of wrecks, and muttered under his breath, "We can't fight gravity with wishes." Back inside, Will stumbled in, clutching a crate. "Sir, bearings from the training division." "Wrong size again, but maybe we can turn them." Finch nodded. "Put them by the lathe." He ran a finger down the list tacked to the wall. 20, 3 aircraft grounded. 19 still silent. He traced the column of notes. Piston warped. Turbine cracked. Oil seals compromised. Each entry felt like a name carved into a memorial. The rain began again, soft at first, then sharp. It pattered against the tin roof, filling the silence between hammers and curses. One of the men slammed his wrench down and cursed louder. "We're not fixing machines anymore," he said. "We're burying them." Finch didn't answer. He moved slowly through the rows of engines, his fingertips brushing over them like a priest reading braille from a tombstone. Every dent, every burn told him what had happened up there, where the air had turned to fire and courage to ash. He paused by a plane they called the Wren. Its nose art, a small brown bird painted mid-flight, was now scarred by flak holes. He climbed up to the cockpit and looked inside. A photo of a girl was pinned near the compass, edges curling from heat. He didn't know the pilot's name, but he knew the man would be waiting somewhere, grounded, counting on him. He looked out over the field. The fog hung low, swallowing the horizon. In it the bombers stood like giants half asleep, gods waiting for resurrection. When he climbed down, the commanding officer was waiting. His coat was soaked, his cap dripping. "I need numbers, Finch. 3 ready by midnight if luck holds," Finch replied. "And the rest?" Finch wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Luck doesn't stretch that far." The officer's jaw clenched. "Then stretch it." He turned and walked away, leaving the words to echo. As the day deepened, the hangar filled with heat and noise. The scent of burning oil thickened, mixing with sweat. Sparks flew as torches cut through old welds, showering the floor in orange light. The men moved like shadows inside that glow, restless, half-starved. Driven by something between duty and desperation, Finch's knuckles split open against a sharp edge. Blood mixed with grease on his hands, but he didn't stop. He tore strips from a rag and wrapped them tight. By late afternoon, one engine came to life with a cough. The sound drew every head toward it. For a moment, hope flickered, until the noise changed. A hollow metallic rattle echoed, rising fast. Finch lunged forward, cutting the power. Silence fell like a curtain. He leaned over the cowling, listening to the stillness that followed failure. "Bearing slipped," he muttered. "Too much vibration. Wrong material. Will kicked the floor. Then what do we use?" Finch stared at the engine, eyes distant. "Something that isn't meant for engines." The words hung there. They didn't make sense yet, not even to him. The commander returned once more, Anger Master's control. We've lost another convoy. No supplies for at least 3 days. Finch straightened, face blank. Then this is all we have. Then make it enough. When the man left, Finch's shoulders dropped. The air in the hangar grew thick, oppressive. Even the light seemed tired. The sound of rain outside faded into the hum of exhaustion. He turned to his team. "Take 5, he said quietly. "Eat something. Think." They obeyed, slumping against toolboxes and crates, their faces pale under the flickering lamps. Some chewed bread too dry to swallow. Others just stared at the floor. Finch didn't rest. He walked to the end of the hangar where wrecked parts had been piled like bones. He crouched beside them, his breath visible in the chill. Metal scraps, twisted propeller arms, fragments of fuselage, waste, in theory. But in waste there was potential. He picked up a broken bracket and turned it in his hands. It was light, flexible, slightly curved. It caught the lantern light like a whisper. The idea was too faint to name, just a flicker, but it was there. He set it aside, making a small pile of pieces that felt right, though he couldn't say why. Outside, engines from another squadron roared as they lifted into the dark sky. Their sound vibrated through the hangar walls, a reminder of what waited at the edge of failure. Will appeared again, holding 2 mangled manifolds. "Sir, if we cut these down and weld the flanges, we might—" Finch shook his head. "Not stable under torque. But if we brace it, it'll shatter at altitude." Will exhaled sharply. "Then what's left?" Finch didn't answer. He just looked toward the far end of the runway, where black smoke still rose from a crash the night before. The war had a way of erasing the line between what was possible and what had to be done. He rubbed his hands together, the grease drying on his skin like armor. "We keep moving." By evening, the rain had stopped, but the cold had sharpened. Breath steamed in the air. The mechanics worked by lamplight, their shadows long against the walls. Finch moved among them, adjusting hands, checking gauges, correcting small errors with the patience of a man fighting chaos 1 inch at a time. He could feel the fatigue creeping up, not in his body, but in their spirits. The spark was fading. At one point, Will dropped a wrench and just stood there, staring at it. Finch walked over, picked it up, and placed it back in his hand. "Tools don't fail," he said softly. "We do." Will nodded, eyes glassy, and went back to work. The hangar filled again with the sound of metal meeting metal. Every clang, every scrape, every hiss of steam was a heartbeat. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the pressure only grew. By 10 p.m., the engines still wouldn't run. One after another, they coughed, sputtered, and fell silent. The men's hope cracked like the metal they worked on. Finch stood at the center of it all, a still figure amid frustration. His jaw tightened. "Enough," he said. "Shut them down." The tools went quiet. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain had been. He looked around at the faces staring back at him. Grace streaked. Hollow-eyed, waiting for something, not orders this time, but belief. He wiped his hands again, slower this time. "Get some sleep. I'll stay." Someone protested, but he raised a hand. "Go." One by one, they left, the hangar emptied, leaving only Finch and the machines. The lanterns burned low. The night outside pressed against the glass. He walked to the center of the room and turned in a slow circle, surrounded by half-built engines and unanswered questions. His boots left prints in the oil on the floor, the only movement left in a place that had run out of time. He stopped by the bench and picked up the cracked turbine blade once more. It caught the dim light and threw it back. Weak but alive, he stared at it for a long time. The impossible still waited. But so did he. He didn't yet know that in this moment, this silence after exhaustion, something extraordinary was beginning to stir, somewhere between logic and madness. The war outside roared on, but inside that hangar, Harold Finch was about to cross the line that separates repair from creation. The hangar was nearly silent by the time the others had gone. Only the ticking of the lantern and the distant hum of generators filled the air. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that glowed faintly under the floodlights. Inside, the shadows stretched long and patient, watching as Finch moved between the dormant engines like a ghost who refused to rest. He laid his tools on the bench one by one, each motion deliberate, ritualistic, a spanner, a file. The cracked turbine blade. The world had narrowed down to these things: steel, breath, and time. Everything else belonged to someone else's war. He ran a thumb along the fracture again, slower this time, tracing it as if it might confess something under his touch. The lantern flame trembled against the polished edge, casting thin veins of gold through the split. The silence began to speak in small ways. The creak of cooling metal. The faint hiss of a kettle someone had forgotten to empty. The heartbeat in his fingertips when he pressed against the steel. He closed his eyes, letting the noise settle inside him. He was trying to listen, not to the war, not to the officers barking orders, but to the machine itself. To its need. Every part had a truth. If you were quiet enough to hear it. Somewhere outside, a bomber tested its engines, the distant roar vibrating through the walls like thunder remembering itself. Finch opened his eyes again. His reflection swam faintly in the blade's curve, a tired man, jaw tight, eyes carrying more weight than rest could cure. He spoke softly. To no one in particular. They want miracles from dust. He turned, reached for a strip of aluminum scavenged from a wrecked wing, and held it up to the lantern. It was thin, pitted, and wrong for the job, but light. He bent it between his palms, feeling the give, the protest, the surrender. Metal had moods, and this one still remembered flight. He smiled faintly. You're not done yet. On a far wall, the rain made soft patterns, dripping from the roof seams. The smell of oil hung heavy, almost sweet. Finch wiped the grime from his cheek with the back of his wrist, leaving a darker streak. He moved to the workbench and laid out the scavenged parts he'd collected earlier, fragments from different machines, pieces of different stories. A bearing from a trainer, a bracket from a Spitfire, a valve ring with teeth worn smooth. He arranged them like words, searching for the sentence they were meant to form. His mind was a map of angles and guesses. Every idea led to another wall, but each wall had seams, and seams could be broken. He began to sketch again, not neatly this time, but with speed. Jagged lines cross, hatched ideas, shapes that might or might not exist. The chalk squeaked across the surface. A new contour emerged, thinner blades, slightly curved, overlapping in a pattern that mimicked wind itself. He didn't know where the thought came from, perhaps a memory, perhaps madness. His father used to say the difference between the two was timing. The chalk snapped between his fingers. He didn't notice. At 1:20 a.m., Will returned quietly, boots dragging. Couldn't sleep, he muttered. Finch didn't look up. Didn't expect you to. Will walked over, rubbing his hands for warmth. He stared at the pile of scrap on the bench. What are we doing now? Finch leaned on the table, studying his chaotic sketches. We're thinking wrong. We've been treating these engines like they're broken versions of what they used to be. They're not. They're something new. They've changed under stress, and so must we. Will frowned, not following. Finch held up two broken blades, aligning them so the curves faced opposite directions. This one cracked under torque. This one bent before it broke. Together they balance. What if instead of fixing one, we learned from both? Will blinked. You mean fuse them? Finch shook his head. Not fuse. Understand. He turned to the drawing again, marking new lines, muttering numbers under his breath. Will could barely follow, but the sound was strangely reassuring. The rhythm of a man arguing with the impossible and starting to win. After a while, Will said quietly, Command's going to ask again at dawn. I know. They won't like hearing no. Finch looked up, eyes dark but steady. Then I'll give them something better than no. I'll give them an answer they won't understand. Until it flies. He picked up a length of steel wire, twisting it between his hands. Get me the acetylene torch, and whatever spoons are left from the mess hall. Will blinked. Spoons. Finch didn't explain. He simply said, trust me. As Will left, Finch looked at the turbine housing again. The problem wasn't strength, it was shape. The airflow had to bend, not fight. The old parts had been too rigid, too proud. What they needed was flexibility, grace under pressure. The spoons, he thought, had just that curve. By the time Will returned with a bundle wrapped in cloth, Finch had cleared the bench and reignited the torch. The blue flame hissed to life. A small sun in the dark. The air shimmered with heat. Finch took one spoon, held it in the flame until it glowed, and watched the metal soften. It gave off a faint smell of burning silver and ash. He set it against the fractured blade, measuring the contours. A near-perfect match. Will watched, disbelief tugging at the edge of his exhaustion. "You can't be serious." Finch smiled faintly. "I'm never serious, I'm desperate." He shaped the spoon's bowl, tapping it with the back of a wrench, molding it like clay until it hugged the fracture's curve. Then, carefully, he began to weld. Sparks burst in short bursts, lighting his face in flickers of orange and white. The sound was like rain striking glass, sharp, rhythmic, alive. When the torch went silent, he leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. The air smelled of heat and hope. The once broken blade now gleamed faintly, a hybrid of weapon and utensil, absurd and perfect. Will stared. "That'll never hold." Finch tilted his head. "Maybe not. But it's the first thing that makes sense in days." He placed the blade into the turbine assembly, fingers steady despite the tremor in his arms. The metal clicked softly into place. For the first time in hours it looked whole. They stood there in silence, both afraid to breathe too loudly. The lantern flickered, shadows moving across their faces. Outside, thunder murmured low and far away. Will finally whispered, "If this works." Finch didn't let him finish. "Then the world will owe a debt to a mess tin." He sat down heavily on a crate, his body beginning to remember pain. The muscles in his hands twitched from hours of work. But inside, something brighter had sparked. He could feel it, the first tremor of possibility. As dawn crept closer, pale light slid across the floorboards, washing away the night's shadows. The hangar began to stir again with life, footsteps, coughing, the clatter of tools. The men filed in, blinking at the new day. They froze when they saw Finch. He was still at his bench, face blackened from smoke, a strange calm in his eyes. "What did you do?" one of them asked. Finch looked up from the turbine. "I stopped following the rules."